in Westminster. That's in half an hour's time on BBC News. Hello, very good afternoon to you. Welcome to BBC News. A leading Brexiteer in the Cabinet has suggested that Parliament will have to look at other options if the UK and the EU can't find a way through on the problem of the so-called Irish backstop as part of the UK's withdrawal agreement from the EU. But the International Trade Secretary Liam Fox dismissed suggestions of another referendum, saying it would not heal divisions in the country. Here's our political correspondent Nick Eardley.
It's not hard to find divisions over Brexit around Parliament. Outside, protesters with different views fight for attention, and inside, MPs struggle to find consensus. Theresa May is trying to get changes she hopes will win the support of MPs, but with little success so far, many are discussing what happens if she fails.
Clearly, if there's no reflection of the anxieties that MPs have had about potentially being locked into the backstop, without any choice, it's unlikely to pass.
Which is where we are now. So if you don't get those kind of changes, then this deal is dead.
Well, in which case, Parliament will have to decide on the alternatives.
Behind closed doors, many are having those conversations. What could happen next? This morning, two of Mrs May's closest allies denied they had discussed the possibility of another referendum. Her Chief of Staff said he wasn't planning one. Her deputy said he doesn't want one.
Supposing we had another referendum, supposing the Remain side won it by 52 to 48, but it was on a lower turnout, entirely possible. Let me tell you that if there is another referendum, which I don't think there will be, people like me will be immediately demanding it's best of three. Where does that end up?
But conversations go on between MPs from different parties.
I think it's absolutely right that we should be having conversations across the parties on these issues. We're in a moment of crisis. We should be putting party political differences to one side and working together in the national interest to try and resolve the mess that we're in.
Labour is having debates of its own on what to do next. There are splits on whether to push for another referendum. But if it got to that stage, what would the party campaign for?
We will be pushing for a Labour deal that protects workers' rights, a Labour deal that protects our consumer protections and our environmental protections, one that has that frictionless trade that the Prime Minister promised but has failed to deliver.
I'm sorry to jump in again, but
there are just a few days before Parliament breaks for Christmas. Some want a no-confidence vote in the Commons. Labour says it will try and force a vote on Theresa May's Brexit plan. After a rollercoaster period, there could be more to come. Nick Eardley, BBC News.
A young boy who was brought out alive from a house fire which killed 2 people in Nottinghamshire yesterday has died. The blaze in Collingham broke out in the morning. A girl aged 8 and a woman of 33 died yesterday. A man remains seriously ill in hospital. Katie Austin reports.
A community in mourning. Prayers were said during today's service at All Saints Church to remember 3 tragic deaths in the same family. Firefighters were called yesterday morning to a house fire which claimed the lives of a 33-year-old woman and her 8-year-old daughter. Today, Nottinghamshire Police said her 5-year-old son, who was rescued and taken to hospital, has also died. A man believed to be the children's father is still in hospital with serious injuries, and a 53-year-old thought to be their grandmother escaped unhurt. People living nearby have described trying to break into the house during the fire in an effort to help. The cause of the blaze is still being investigated.
I think we are all aware.
All Saints Church will now be open every day until Christmas, so residents of the close-knit village of Collingham can leave prayers or messages of condolence for a mother and her 2 children. Katie Austin, BBC News.
Environmental groups have said a deal struck at a UN conference in Poland does not go far enough in tackling climate change. Delegates from nearly 200 countries reached agreement on how to implement the landmark Paris Climate Accord of 2015. They also outlined plans for a common rulebook on cutting carbon emissions. But the commitments are not legally binding. Here's our science editor, David Schuckman.
Applause and relief that 2 long weeks of negotiation were over, and that a deal to try to tackle climate change has at last emerged.
In a moment in which there are many conflicts in the world, many disagreements amongst countries, to find agreement by unanimity, by consensus, to fight global warming is very good news.
Most significant is a set of rules for how countries cut their emissions of the gases warming the planet. That was sorted. On finance for developing countries to help them adapt and go green, some progress, but they say not enough. And on promises of much deeper cuts in emissions, which many say are needed, that'll have to be discussed later. Many diplomats are relieved to have made it this far. But some developing countries, faced with the threat of rising sea levels, say the deal does not go nearly far enough and that bolder steps are needed.
We got 12 years. The decision here today doesn't really solve anything. I think we got to do practical things. We got to cut down the emission drastically in terms of emissions. So I think working together, I think we can achieve what really we want.
The real test is whether the deal actually leads to less of this, warming gases entering the atmosphere. And so far, all the talk over the past 25 years hasn't managed to achieve that. David Shukman, BBC News.
Welcome with me is Dr. Mikhail Nakshmani from the Grantham Research Institute, the LSE, which specialises in climate change. You're just back from Katowice this weekend. What do you think has been achieved?
Well, for 197 countries to get in one room and agree on every single letter and word in a very, very complicated agreement, that in itself is a great achievement. Now, the deal is not good enough, as we all know, but it sends a very clear signal on where we must be progressing to. On the sides of the deal, amazing things have been happening to go with that. We've seen a momentum going in many directions. The first one is the investor community signing up. Very unthinkable a few years ago for investors to be signing up to this. The investor agenda with over 33 trillion of assets.
So saying it makes commercial good sense to actually be supporting climate change initiatives, adapting to the climate and so on in terms of business practice.
Absolutely, and business risk and systemic risk, of course. The second thing that we see is a recognition that we need to transition into a zero-carbon economy whilst taking social and political aspects into account, looking at what we call the just transition, not leaving anyone behind.
And I think there were, 41 countries who signed up to that.
Yeah.
So that's good, but that's still only a proportion of all the countries who were there. But just to pick up on the core of this, isn't the difficulty that this is, we had 3 years ago, we had the climate agreement, the kind of framework, if you like. Now we've got the detail of how countries will implement their policies and, more importantly, report their progress to the UN. What we don't necessarily have from each country is actual concrete steps, a measurable plan. So, for example, Indonesia says, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do better than a business as usual case, but then doesn't specify how that will happen. And if you're talking about trying to prevent climate change in the next decade and by the middle of the century, well, all of that is not going to achieve that, is it?
That's absolutely right. Countries must now go home and ratchet up their climate laws, their policies, the governance structures that they have to carry all of this forward, and the money that they throw at this. This has to be anchored in a very, very robust financial commitment from all the countries. And we know that countries are not doing far enough, and they're not doing it fast enough. Most countries that have set quantified targets, for example, have set them only to 2020. They must do something quicker and better immediately. We
had a report out from the IPCC panel which was trying to set out what it thought would be the consequences, or likely consequences, nobody can be 100% certain, but the likely consequences of a 1.5 degree temperature rise. They're pretty devastating.
They are.
Some of the countries at the conference didn't want to welcome that report. There's another report that's come out today suggesting that actually we could be moving already beyond that in the next 20 or so years. Set against that, all of this kind of hearty backslapping, saying, haven't we done well, haven't we got the message for that we're not going to sell out the next generation, all the rest of it, it all looks a bit thin.
Let's take out the 4 countries who refused to welcome, and as you know, the Paris Agreement requires unanimous agreement, so 193 countries have wholeheartedly welcomed it. The 47 least developed countries and small island developing states have wholeheartedly and unequivocally welcomed it in a declaration from the LDC chair, the least developed countries chair. Everyone knows that this is going on. The political interests of Saudi Arabia, Russia, the US and so on are very clear to all of us. But as we...
And the problem is every country has political interests that aren't just straightforward climate ones.
That's true. If you look at the US, subnational cities, businesses have all signed. The huge American pavilion called We Are Still In, which is not the federal one, is really moving forward. Not fast enough, not good enough. We need to do more. But it's okay to sometimes pause for a little, I don't know if pat on the back is the right term, but for acknowledging that there's a growing understanding that this is the direction and this is the speed that must be taken up forward.
Well, Dr. Mashlini, thank you very much. Neshmani, I'm so sorry.
Don't worry.
I'll get it right third time you come in and talk to us about the next stage of this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now, a fundraising campaign by Chester Zoo to raise £50,000 following a fire which destroyed much of the roof covering its monsoon forest area has reached its target in little more than 24 hours. Chester Zoo said yesterday was one of the toughest days in its long history, and it thanked the remarkable efforts of the zoo team, the emergency services, which meant that the fire was extinguished as quickly as possible. In a statement released this morning, the zoo said, "We're devastated that we were unable to save some of our insects, frogs, fish and small birds who were located near to the outbreak of the fire. It's absolutely heartbreaking to lose any animal, especially when conservationists have worked so hard to breed these wonderful species." Now, a group of MPs has said the rollout of a type of smart motorways where the hard shoulder is permanently turned into a fourth lane should be stopped. The all-party group backed campaigners who say having no hard shoulder puts motorists and recovery workers at risk. England has more than 100 miles of what are called all-lane running smart motorways, with 225 miles more planned. But are smart motorways more dangerous than traditional motorways? Well, someone who can hopefully help to answer that question is Jack Cousins, the AA's head of roads policy, who joins us now. Jack, thanks very much for being with us on BBC News. Let me ask you first of all about the conclusion of the MP's report. Do you echo it? Do you agree with them that this has to be stopped for now?
Yes, we do agree with the all-party parliamentary group, and that's simply because there is a lot of safety concern around them, not just in terms of when there is an incident because all lanes are being used, but also in terms of getting the emergency services to the scene of the accident. There was an incident yesterday, there was a road collision on the M25 on that stretch of all-lane running, and that queued for several hours. And again, if all four lanes are being used, it begs the question, how can the emergency services fight their way through to get to that scene as quickly as possible?
Yes, because presumably an air ambulance is all very well, but that still needs somewhere to land, and you might not have land around the motorway that is suitable.
Yes, it does. Now, there are methods that the emergency services can use, for example, travelling back down the carriageway in the opposite direction once they're confident that enough traffic has cleared in front of the incident in question. But for the majority of cases, they will be coming in the same direction as that incident, and they'll be looking for a way to try and pick their way through four lanes of traffic, and they do struggle. When we gave evidence to the Transport Select Committee, as well as the emergency services, we all raised that risk, but yet the government decided that all-lane running was the smart motorway scheme of preference, and that's the one they continue to roll out.
Your alternative is, in a sense, acknowledges that probably public pressure, political pressure for improvements to reduce congestion and the demand for motorway space means that this is probably going to continue in some form. It's unlikely to be abandoned altogether. And you were talking about emergency areas and more of them where people can get off the motorways safely.
So under the original concept of all-lane running smart motorways, they were spaced every 800 metres apart, and indeed when it was trialled on the M42, that was the spacing used. However, once they got past the trial, the government decided to increase the distance to every 1.5 miles.
So bluntly, there are fewer of them.
So yes, it certainly made fewer of them. Now, after consistent pressure from ourselves, the Highways England in February decided to change that down to every 1.5 miles to every mile. However, we still feel that that's still too far spaced apart, and we would like to go to the 800 metres used in the trial scheme. We understand and appreciate that easing congestion and improving motorway capacity is important, but safety should not be the compromising factor.
It's very striking when some of the figures that are quoted by the report, they say that last year on stretches of motorway which have all lanes running, including the hard shoulder, there were 16 crashes. Over the same period, and that's on about 100 miles of road are affected. In the same period, on 1,800 miles of road, in other words, those that still have a hard shoulder, there were 29 similar crashes. Do you think that proportionately the risk has increased because of this?
We think it has, and it's partly simply because drivers are not aware or simply haven't quite grasped the concept of how they're meant to interact with smart motorways. And indeed they can be forgiven because there are three types of smart motorway. There's managed motorway, which looks like a traditional motorway with a hard shoulder, but it has a gantry over the top which changes the speed limit. There's dynamic hard shoulder, which is the M42, where the hard shoulder can be used at peak times only, and there is signage that tells you when to use the hard shoulder and not. And then finally there's the government's preferred scheme, which is all-lane running, where you have the hard shoulder permanently converted into a running lane with the emergency refuge areas as a trade point. So you've got four different types of motorway being used alongside each other at the same time, and even within that, all-lane running has two different looks and feels to it at the moment. So established drivers can be forgiven as to not understanding fully how they're meant to interact with the system.
But there's one thing we are able to understand, at least if the MPs are right, and that is that some people are experiencing more serious injury and potentially death because of this approach to managing the roads.
That is absolutely correct. And I suppose one of the things that goes into this is when a vehicle is broken down in a live lane, at the gantry behind the incident, a red cross is displayed. Now, for 2 years, Highways England have been sending out warning letters to drivers saying that you should not be driving in a red X lane. And they have sent out more than 170,000 of these warning letters.
So these people who've been picked up on cameras driving in those lanes, despite the fact there's a big red cross on the gantry above them.
Absolutely. And what we need is for the Home Office to finally get to the conclusion that they need to start sending out and issuing fines and points for Red Cross misuse. The whole reason the Red Cross is there is to try and protect the vulnerable vehicle as much as possible. And we understand from research that we have carried out that drivers will sometimes behave like sheep. So if they see somebody driving in that red cross lane, they're more tempted to get in that lane as well. And we need to stress and make it absolutely clear that you must stay out of that lane with a red cross for as long as you see that red cross.
Jack Cousins, Head of Roads Policy at the AA. It's an important topic. Thanks very much for joining us to talk about it this afternoon. Right, let's take a look at the headlines on BBC News. It's just approaching 19 minutes past 2. The Cabinet Brexiteer Liam Fox says MPs have already decided on the UK's Brexit options as he backs Theresa May's condemnation of calls by Tony Blair and others for a second referendum. A 5-year-old boy becomes the third victim of a house fire in Nottinghamshire. A mother and her 8-year-old died yesterday. Environmental groups have criticised the deal struck at a climate change conference in Poland, saying it does not go far enough to tackle rising temperatures. Bad weather and an increasing trend to buy online are being blamed for shoppers staying away from the high street on what is usually the busiest weekend before Christmas. Retail experts say footfall across the UK yesterday was down almost 10% compared with the same period last year. Our business correspondent Joe Miller reports.
A bruising year has left many of Britain's large retailers fighting for survival and more than ever banking on a busy festive season. But heavy rain heaped more misery on the high street yesterday and prompted many to stay dry and shop online.
There was a sliver of hope for retailers last week when footfall rose 6% on the year before. But figures from analytics firm Springboard show a drop of 7% on Saturday if you include retail parks and shopping centres, and a drop of 9% on the high street, adding further gloom to one of the worst Novembers on record.
Analysts see few bright spots ahead.
We've seen consumer confidence drop, we've seen costs increase, and in general I think people are very nervous about spending.
The British Retail Consortium predicts that sales will pick up in the next few days as more people rush to buy last-minute food and presents. The fate of one chain in particular may rest on such a surge. Debenhams, which lost a record £500 million this financial year, has rebuffed an injection of cash from the self-styled saviour of the high street, Mike Ashley. His company Sports Direct, which rescued House of Fraser, had a stark warning for its wounded rival.
We've put this offer in to invest another 40 million, and it really is kind of the electric shock to wake them up to what is probably the last chance saloon.
Some suspect Mr. Ashley, who is already Debenhams' largest shareholder, wants the first claim on its assets if it collapses, an allegation his company rejects. But while Debenhams and other struggling chains might just be able to afford to keep the billionaire at bay, neither they nor Mr. Ashley's retail empire can afford this disappointing Christmas. Joe Miller, BBC News.
Right, let's bring you some pictures that have just come into us from the Belgian capital, Brussels, this afternoon in the last half hour. And there are clashes between police officers and protesters campaigning against migration. The protests were in opposition to a UN process, which not all countries have signed up to actually, but which proposes new rights for migrants travelling between countries. These protesters who are angry about this proposal, obviously it's been a highly contentious subject, particularly in some parts of the continent, some of the border parts, the edge of the EU rather than perhaps in Belgium, but nonetheless the protesters have come to Brussels, fairly obvious reasons, the headquarters of the European community, including the European Union, I should say, I'm showing my age, the European Union, and as you see, riot police dealing with them fairly quickly and robustly, but a little bit of trouble on the streets of Brussels this afternoon. Those are protesters opposing UN attempts to give more rights to migrants. Now, it's that weekend, the last one but one before Christmas, which means it's the BBC Sports Personality of the Year Awards in Birmingham. But as the format has changed this year, we won't actually know at this stage, and indeed we won't know until the programme comes on to air tonight, who the potential nominees are. Let's talk to our sports presenter, Holly Hamilton. Holly, we're still all very envious of you being up there. It's the party of the weekend. What can we expect?
You're right, Sean. I can say that the party hasn't quite started just yet, but it is, of course, one of the more glamorous events in the sporting calendar, isn't it? The BBC Sports Personality of the Year 2018. Now, there are a few changes this year as well. This is the point where normally I would start to tell you about the nominees, but frankly, I don't have a clue. No one does. The shortlist is top secret this year. They won't be revealed until the start of the programme, which starts on BBC One at 7 o'clock tonight. Another change, Sean, we have a brand new award. It is for the Sporting Moment of the Year. Now, the shortlist for that has been released already. You've been voting online to choose your favourite between 5 nominees. Who could forget, of course, the England netballers there on the list, following their Commonwealth gold medal in the Gold Coast at the World Cup in Russia. England qualifying for the quarter-finals after beating Colombia on penalties. Tiger Woods' comeback in Atlanta in September. Alistair Cook with that century in his final game for England at the Oval. And more recently, of course, just in December, Tyson Fury coming back from 2 knockdowns to draw with WBC heavyweight champion Deontay Wilder. So much to choose from, and those will be revealed tonight along with many others. And if you haven't voted yet, there is still time. You can still vote for your BBC Sports Personality of the Year when those names are released this evening after 7 o'clock, Sean.
Yeah, it's a good reason to tune in at 7, since we'll only find out as then who the nominees are. The organisers explain this because I suspect some people will be wondering whether this has anything to do with the controversy there's been in previous years when they've released the nominations, and then there's been a couple of days of publicity in the papers mainly saying it's an outrage this person's missing, or it's an outrage that person is included, or it's an outrage that these people have helped to do the shortlist. What do they know about sport?
Well, this has been the problem, I think, in previous years when they've released the shortlist, and sometimes there have been around about 16, maybe 17 names on that list, and it gives maybe fans or people in the local area a chance to rally together a little bit of support. Jonathan Ray was a perfect example last year, whenever I think the whole of Northern Ireland, it's fair to say, gathered together to make sure he was high up there. He came runner-up last year, of course, very well deserved though, with 4 World Championship titles under his belt. But the other idea about this is to, well, let's see more of the action. When there are so many people on the list, Sean, it's very difficult just to see the reason why they are on there, what they have done throughout the year. So also the introduction of the best sporting moments of the year, we'll be able to enjoy those sporting moments, be able to relive them again, watch them in all their glory, and that really surely is what it's all about, a celebration of British sport, Sean. Yeah, indeed, and a lot of atmosphere added to the occasion tonight. We'll look forward to that, and I should say, Holly, in you leading us to this point, thank you very much. I know you're going to be back later
because we have a special programme here on the BBC News channel beginning at 5 o'clock this afternoon, or just after 5 o'clock, just after the headlines. Then you'll be able to join the team in Birmingham to watch the arrivals on the red carpet, no less. And it is a red carpet, so even when it's sport, hopefully nobody is wearing their any of their sports shoes or boots on that red carpet, otherwise it's going to be a hell of a dry cleaning bill to be made. Now, 11.7 million people watched the finale of Strictly Come Dancing on BBC One last night. The documentary presenter Stacey Dooley won with her professional partner Kevin Clifton. He'd been a losing finalist on 4 previous occasions. David Sillito has more.
It's the final!
The Strictly final. 4 couples, 3 dances, and from the very beginning, it was Ashley Roberts, the former Pussycat Doll, who set the standard. The big lift from Dirty Dancing was flawless.
10.
The score, perfect 10s. And those 40s kept coming. This athletic show dance on a raised and revolving platform.
I personally, as a dancer, feel that you've stretched yourself beyond limits. You've learnt techniques that you were not familiar with ever before. You have brought to this show a life, a style, and I truly am grateful to you.
Of course, Craig did try to find a fault.
I had a small problem with your right toe, darling. But then I decided to get over myself.
The point was dropped all night. But matching those scores, dance after dance, was Faye Tozer.
Come on along and listen to the lullaby.
This Hollywood glitz in high heels on a very high top hat. And at the end of this routine to fever, it was perfect 10s across the board.
What an end of a journey. Wow.
Wow, this is really high. But when it comes to a journey to go from being a non-dancer to doing this, YouTuber Joe Sugg was more than holding his own. Ending with a Charleston.
You are the biggest surprise of this series. I mean, from a marathon night of dances tonight, you have just got stronger and stronger. And it's an extraordinary amount of work that you have put in, and it has paid off. You are a star on the dance floor.
For TV journalist Stacey Dooley, it began with a foxtrot. And then an explosive show dance. Everything was thrown at it. The crowd loved it. Bruno tried to describe it as her greatest hits. But Craig...
I wasn't that keen on the dance. I'm only being honest.
It was the lowest score of the night. And even at the end of a Paso Doble described as having power and passion, she was in 4th place. But this isn't up to the judges. All that matters is what the public thinks. And they saw it rather differently.
Stacey
And even more emotional was her professional dance partner, Kevin Clifton. 5 finals, his first Strictly victory. So there it is, the winner of this year's Glitterball Trophy, Stacey Dooley. David Sillito, BBC News.
Now, we've yet to see his cha-cha-cha, but we can listen to his forecast. It's Chris Fawkes at the map. Good afternoon, Chris.
Well, Sean, the weather's been so cold it would appear I'm completely frozen to the spot, so no dancing from me. Yeah, Storm Deirdre caused all kinds of problems yesterday. Quick sum up of what we had. We had some freezing rain, really nasty stuff affecting parts of northern England and Scotland, leading to a number of accidents, multiple accidents actually. Northern Scotland saw some snow and we had some very windy weather. Top gusts 79 miles an hour in the western side of Wales. But since then the weather's been turning milder. Outbreaks of rain pushing from west to east across England at the moment, so clearing away from Wales. Into Scotland, we'll continue to see a few showers here, but by and large, the skies will clear, the winds will fall light overnight, and it's going to be a cold night with some patches of frost and a few patches of fog to take us into Monday morning. Monday, though, apart from being a chilly start to the day, for most of us will be a glorious one with plenty of morning sunshine. However, it will cloud over from the west as we go through the day, outbreaks of rain arriving, and it will turn windy with gales around some western areas, but it will be relatively mild, with the day's top temperature up to about 12 degrees in the west. That's your latest weather.
Hello, this is BBC News with Sean Lay. The headlines this hour. Cabinet Brexiteer Liam Fox says MPs have already decided on the UK's Brexit options. He backs Theresa May in condemning calls for a further referendum.
Let me tell you that if there is another referendum, which I don't think there will be, people like me will be immediately demanding it's best of three.
A 5-year-old boy becomes the third victim of a house fire in Nottinghamshire yesterday. A mother and her 8-year-old daughter had already died. MPs say the rollout of smart motorways, where the hard shoulder is permanently turned into a fourth lane, should be stopped for safety reasons. Now on BBC News, time for A Week in Parliament.
Hello and welcome to the Week in Parliament, your backstop to the most turbulent, dramatic week at Westminster since the last one.
The Parliamentary Party does have confidence.
Yeah! The Prime Minister survives an attempt to force her out, but that wasn't the meaningful vote MPs had been expecting.
This House agreed the 5 days of debate. This House agreed when the vote was going to take place.
Amid chaos, an MP removes a symbol of royal authority in protest. This was a week of two votes, one that happened, one that didn't. Theresa May saw off an attempted coup by her own MPs, but only after promising not to lead them into the next election. Even then, more than a third voted against her. That vote was prompted by her decision to pull the vote Parliament expected on her Brexit deal. As late as Monday morning, ministers insisted the vote scheduled for Tuesday was going ahead. It wasn't. The Prime Minister told MPs she detected concern about what the deal would mean for Northern Ireland.
As a result, if we went ahead and held the vote tomorrow, the deal would be rejected by a significant margin. We will therefore defer the vote scheduled for tomorrow and not proceed to divide the House at this time. But, Mr. Speaker, if you take a step back, it is clear that this House faces a much more fundamental question. Does this House want to deliver Brexit? And a clear message from the SNP, but if the House does it want to do so through reaching an agreement with the EU? If the answer is yes, and I believe that is the answer of the majority of this House, then we all have to ask ourselves whether we're prepared to make a compromise, because there will be no enduring and successful Brexit without some compromise on both sides of the debate.
The government is in disarray. Uncertainty is building for business. People are in despair at the state of these failed negotiations and concerned about what it means about their jobs, their livelihood and their communities. And the fault for that lies solely at the door of this shambolic government. The Prime Minister is trying to buy herself one last chance to save this deal. If she doesn't take on board the fundamental changes required, then she must make way for those who can.
The Speaker wasn't impressed either.
Halting the debate after no fewer than 164 colleagues have taken the trouble to contribute will be thought by many members of this House to be deeply discourteous. I politely suggest that in any courteous, respectful and mature environment, allowing the House to have a say, its say, on this matter would be the right and, dare I say it, the obvious course to take.
But the government chose not to take the obvious course, annoying its own side in the process.
The whole House wanted to debate this. We wanted to vote on it. The people expected us to vote on it. And the government have gone and run away and hidden in the toilets. And people watching this on television will be confused and bemused and very, very angry at the way their own Parliament has let them down. The government front bench should literally be ashamed of themselves.
Well, I simply do not agree with my honourable friend's assessment.
So on Tuesday, MPs had an emergency debate about why they weren't having a debate on the Brexit deal and the so-called meaningful vote. By Wednesday, enough Conservative MPs had submitted letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister to trigger a ballot on her future. It was almost business as usual at Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, today I will have meetings, possibly many meetings, with ministerial colleagues and others.
Kerry McCarthy!
So just a normal day in the office then, Prime Minister?
Jeremy Corbyn had another vote on his mind.
Can she now confirm that we will have the concluding days of debate and votes within the next 7 days before the House rises for the Christmas recess?
Well, everybody says when. I'll tell members on the other side when we've had a meaningful vote. We had it in the referendum on 2016. And if he wants a meaningful date, I'll give him one. 29th of March 2019, when we leave the European Union.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Totally and absolutely unacceptable to this House in any way. This House agreed a programme motion. This House agreed the 5 days of debate. This House agreed when the vote was going to take place. The government tried to unilaterally pull that and deny this House the chance of a vote on this crucial matter. The Prime Minister and her government have already been found to be in contempt of Parliament. Her behaviour today is just contemptuous of this Parliament and of this process.
This government is a farce. The Tory party is in chaos. The Prime Minister is a disgrace for their actions. The reality is that people across Scotland and the UK are seeing this today. Prime Minister, take responsibility, do the right thing, resign.
Theresa May said deferring the vote proved she'd been listening. Her Tory critics largely stayed silent during question time. A former cabinet colleague who once described her as a bloody difficult woman weighed in with his support.
Can my right honourable friend think of anything more unhelpful, irrelevant and irresponsible than for the Conservative Party to embark on weeks of a Conservative leadership election?
My right honourable and learned friend has raised an important issue, and I think it is the impact that those weeks of that campaign would have on the decision that the House has to take and the decision that we have to take as a country in relation to leaving the European Union, because there is no doubt that would go beyond the legislative date of the 21st of January, and it would mean that were a new leader to come in, that one of the first things they would have to do would be to either extend Article 50 or rescind Article 50, and that would mean either delaying or stopping Brexit.
Smaller opposition parties tried to put pressure on the largest, Labour, to call a House of Commons vote of no confidence in the whole government.
Prime Minister judge that it is more welcome or more appropriate to face a no-confidence motion from her backbenchers or from the Leader of the Opposition?
I say to the right honourable gentleman, that is not... Obviously, we have one of those which is going to take place.
And so the most meaningful vote of the week did take place, not in the chamber, but in a Commons committee room.
The result of the ballot held this evening is that the parliamentary party does have confidence. The number of votes cast in favour of having confidence in Theresa May was 200, and against was 117.
And that reaction suggested Theresa May's victory left many questions unanswered, some of which were put to the Leader of the House on Thursday.
It's the morning after the night before, and as the hangovers start to kick in, they'll all be asking themselves, just what on earth did we get up to last night? As they see the wreckage of their night of mayhem, we now find that we have a Prime Minister who only has the confidence of 200 members of this House. A lame duck Prime Minister who would give waterfowl with walking sticks a bad name.
The Prime Minister won 63% of the vote, and that was against 37% who didn't support her, and that means she won that vote by a significant majority.
She is deliberately pursuing a policy of running down the clock and spending taxpayers' money in order to blackmail Parliament into supporting her deal. Can I tell her now, it will not work?
I would like to know when, oh when, are we going to get to have our meaningful vote?
And as I've said, and as my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster said, at the very latest by the 21st of January.
Downing Street said later that the vote wouldn't take place before Christmas. And after all that, Theresa May's still in number 10. But what does her win in that confidence vote mean for her Brexit plans? Has anything changed? Who better to ask than Dr. Catherine Haddon, who's a senior fellow at the Institute for Government.
It doesn't change the arithmetic that she already faced. I'm not sure how much it will change her relationship with her party. One assumes that many of the people that voted no confidence were many of the people that were likely to have had a problem with the deal, the reason why she pulled that on Monday. So in that sense, no. I think it changes things slightly for her depending on how she uses it, because obviously they can't now use the leadership vote of confidence, the Conservative Party vote of confidence, to try and oust her for another year. So she knows that she's safe, at least from that point of view. But no, it doesn't change anything in terms of what she's got to do to try and get the deal through Parliament.
So it gives her some breathing space, but not a lot, because she's told us that vote is going to take place before January the 21st.
That's right. January the 21st was this all-important date whereby the government had to bring a deal, or at least inform if it hadn't got a deal, and was likely to end up having a no-deal situation.
Now, back in the early 1970s, another Conservative Prime Minister, Ted Heath, got Britain into the European Economic Community, as it was then, with the votes of opposition Labour MPs. Could Theresa May take a leaf out of his book?
It's always been one of the possibilities open to her. We know that there's all sorts of different factions in Parliament at the moment, and they completely cross party boundaries at the moment. There's various little groups and factions and so forth who are looking for different deals, and we've been seeing that with the kind of amendments that have been put down in the kind of groupings of MPs who are getting together, not just in Parliament but also on Twitter and elsewhere, to try and sort of push their vision of what we could do now. So she's always had a different range of options of people she could go to, some of whom would be Labour MPs. Thus far, she seems to have focused on her core vote, which is trying to hold the Conservative Party together and the all-important DUP votes to try and get over the line. But, you know, if the reports have all been true in the run-up to last weekend and the expected meaningful vote, there is a core rump of Conservative MPs who are unlikely to support her deal, whatever shape it comes back in. The DUP is another question. How she responds to that, tries to bring the confidence and supply agreement back on board, we don't know.
Now, she survived one vote of confidence in her own party. Why haven't Labour moved a vote of confidence in Parliament to try to force her out?
I think the key must be that they don't think they can win it at the moment, because they would need, again, either some Conservatives to vote down their own government, which is a very big deal. It's different from the vote of confidence that they had in their own Conservative Party rules. It's different indeed from the vote of contempt that we saw as well, that was won against the government, because it would basically be bringing down your own government. It would be bringing about a general election, very likely, unless they could win a second vote of confidence. And it's a very sort of serious thing to do, to bring down your own government, and to say to the world, you know, I as a Conservative MP have no confidence in my own government, is a very different thing. So I think Labour must feel they can't win it at the moment, and I think they must only want to go for it if they feel that they can.
Jeremy Corbyn said he'd move a vote of confidence at the appropriate time, but it sounds like we shouldn't really hold our breath.
I think it seems unlikely to happen before the Christmas recess. The House breaks next Thursday, and also even if Labour put down a motion at this point, it's then for the government to timetable it. Usual practice is that that would happen very early. It would be happening under a different system of rules than previous votes of confidence that we've seen in the past. So when the government would be wanting to timetable a vote like that, whether they could do it very quickly or whether they would want a bit more time. You go back to the last times we had votes of confidence, which was the late 1970s, you would see a week or so at least, which allowed the government time to try and build up support, create deals. In 1977 they managed to get their own sort of confidence and supply agreement with the Liberals, which kept them in power for another 2 years.
Catherine Haddon, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Catherine Haddon. Time now for a breather from Brexit. We all need one now and again. And a brief look at a few other goings-on around Westminster. A ban on the sale of ivory in the UK has moved a step closer after the Ivory Bill finished its parliamentary journey. Around 20,000 African elephants are killed by poachers each year for their ivory tusks. The bill aims to curb elephant poaching and a growing black market in ivory. But there were warnings that more needs to be done to preserve the world's wildlife.
Whether it be elephants or whether it be whales, whether it be giraffes, whether it be any sort of species like this, unless we wake up as a world, these animals are going to be extinct.
The problems at Birmingham Prison that followed a riot there 2 years ago led the prison service to take it back temporarily from the private company G4S. MPs on the Justice Committee wanted to know more about the government's plans.
Minister, will you be handing the prison back to G4S on the 20th of January as planned?
Not if that prison is not a stable, clean, safe, decent prison. We will not be handing that prison back unless we are absolutely confident that that prison is now fully under control and G4S is able to run a safe, decent, clean prison in the future.
Back to wildlife, and pygmy elephants, tigers and orangutans are three of the species being hit by the world's increasing use of palm oil. It's used in everything from pizza to chocolate, shampoo to lipstick. In Westminster Hall, MPs debated a petition signed by more than 80,000 people calling for products containing unsustainably sourced palm oil to be banned.
We are acting domestically, but we will continue to press for global and concerted action across all the areas to ensure that we're successful. That's why we will continue to support business, other governments and civil society to develop methods of production that are environmentally, socially and economically sustainable. And we will continue to act on that so that genuinely we can do our best to leave the global environment in a better condition for the next generation.
A former health minister launched an attempt to legalise cannabis. Norman Lamb said the government's decision to allow some patients to access cannabis-based medicines didn't go far enough.
Another constituent who is rapidly advancing Parkinson's disease also uses cannabis. It's the only thing that helps him. He has also been told by his GP that he can't be referred to a specialist for cannabis to be prescribed. So we leave this man, who is acutely unwell, having to break the law in order to get relief from pain. This is surely cruel and inhuman.
But his bill was blocked by MPs. Back to Brexit now, there's no escape, and a bruising encounter for civil service mandarins before MPs on the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Select Committee. They've been trying to find out what impact planning for Brexit is having on the other things in the government's in-tray.
Some departments, for example, have paused some of their other domestic policy agenda in order to focus their attention on planning for the 29th of March. And that partly reflects the nature of their Brexit portfolio, if you like, compared to others. In some other cases, that we're releasing officials to do so. Each department essentially needs to make its own judgments between the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary about what their capacity is to deliver. But essentially, the Brexit agenda is incorporated alongside the rest of the department's agenda. In some cases, we've had increases in resources, and I think you'll be familiar with some of the numbers on that. But then they have to prioritise within that and mainstream as much as they can of the work to navigate their particular portfolios through the Brexit transition.
One Brexit-supporting MP complained about the chief executive of the civil service referring to leaving the EU without a deal as a disorderly Brexit.
I'm just concerned that the use of expressions like that may be, if you like, communicating a lack of readiness on the part of the government and the civil service, and may also be causing some concern among those who are expecting the government and the civil service to deliver an orderly Brexit, whether it's negotiated or not.
So on a negotiated Brexit, we'll have 2 more years to make it more orderly than we will if we don't have a negotiated Brexit. And that was the basis of my... Well, that's at least the basis of the agreement. So,
forgive my interrupting, but to repeat, it's been perfectly obvious since before we served the Article 50 notice that we might leave without a deal. So surely the contingency of leaving without a deal should have been something that was planned for.
Well, it has been, as I've mentioned. We've we've hired 15,000 people in order to prepare for all of this.
So why is it disorderly?
Well, it's because as I've said, there will be consequences without a deal, which will not be fully mitigated, such as the border that we've just spent some time talking about.
But those are things that you can plan for and you can make contingencies for. I have to say, I really think that the use of expressions such as disorderly Brexit by some
I should say less orderly.
It really does concern me, because you used it as if it was an expression that was in currency in the civil service generally. I really think that is really worrying, and I really do wonder whether it's an expression you should continue using.
Some orderly arguments there on the committee corridor. Now, as Westminster remains obsessed by Brexit and talk of Theresa May's leadership, politicians in other parts of the UK have been getting on with their day jobs. In Cardiff, where Labour's been in power for almost 20 years, Labour's Mark Drakeford, a Jeremy Corbyn supporter, was sworn in as the new First Minister of Wales, replacing Carwyn Jones.
Mark Drakeford, ydych chi'n barod yn oed y datganiad swydd Prif Weinidog Cymru?
Diolch yn fawr, dwi'n barod. It is, as you all know from yesterday's proceedings, an enormous privilege to lead a political party here in Wales, and even more so, to be nominated and elected as First Minister in the National Assembly. I am absolutely conscious both of the opportunity and the responsibility which comes with this position.
At Holyrood, Scotland's Finance Minister told